Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to our second webinar on your conscience during the fourth annual National Conscience Month. My name is Jennifer Masters, and I am a student and instructor at the American Meditation Institute, AMI. I hope you were able to join us last week for our first webinar, where we discussed an ancient understanding of the mind, including your conscience, which is very different from our contemporary cultural concept of the conscience. As I mentioned last week, all of the material in that website is discussed in this very practical little book called Your Conscience. And you can also find a recording of that webinar online at our website, americanmeditation.org, in case you missed it. So tonight we are going to take the next step and hear from a panel of experts, yoga scientists, who have conducted a variety of different experiments with the conscience. They are going to tell us what happened when they decided to coordinate the four functions of their mind and rely on their conscience to help them know what to do and what not to do, what to say and what not to say in every moment. Our goal tonight is to share a variety of perspectives with you and possibly to inspire you to undertake your own experiments. There's some wonderful guidance on how to do that in the book, Your Conscience, as well. So with that, we're very glad you're here, and let's go ahead and get started. I will first introduce you to Leonard and Janice Perlmutter, co-founders and co-directors of the American Meditation Institute and the originators of National Conscience Month. Janice is a prolific artist whose work is in numerous public and private collections, including most notably Presidents Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton and the late Queen Elizabeth. Leonard, in addition to teaching at AMI, has served on the faculties of the New England Institute of Ayurvedic Medicine in Boston and the International Himalayan Yoga Teachers Association in Calgary, Canada. Leonard has also taught workshops on the benefits of meditation and yoga science at numerous medical schools, media outlets, and corporate settings. Since 2009, his 6-week foundation course on AMI meditation has been certified for continuing medical education credits by the American Medical Association and the American Nurses Association. And with that, I hand it over to my teacher, Leonard Perlmutter, who will offer a brief summary of this different understanding of the conscience.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank each of you for joining us this day. The topic for this particular webinar, your conscience, how to use it, everywhere, every day, should be very interesting for each of you, provided that you can focus your one-pointed attention and have a desire, a curiosity about experimenting with coordinating the four functions of the mind: the ego, the senses, the unconscious, and your conscience. So with that, let's get started. So we're going to be talking about coordinating the four functions of the mind to help you benefit from your own conscience. But remember, the mind moves first. Then the body follows with speech and action. And of course, consequences always flow from every action that we take. You know, we can't even raise our hand without first entertaining a thought. Thoughts are our most powerful resource. So let's just summarize briefly how to coordinate the four functions of the mind, how each of the functions operates, and how you can experiment with coordinating your own mind. So there are four functions of the mind, but only 3 of them, you see, are advisors. Can't make a decision. That's the unconscious, the senses, and the ego. The unconscious is our storehouse of memories and habits, everything that we deem essential to self-preservation. It can be very positive and very helpful. On the other hand, there are some faulty concepts that we have that are stored in our unconscious. And when we use them, it causes pain to ourselves and others. The unconscious only has a limited perspective, not a 360-degree panoramic view. As advisor, desiring to have its limited perspective adopted by the mind and an action is loud and pushy and insistent that its limited perspective be adopted. That's the unconscious. We're all familiar, the storehouse of memories and habits. The second function is the senses of sight, smell, taste, hearing, and touch. The senses, you see, extrude our creative energy to go out into the world, to look and smell and taste and listen and touch. All these objects and relationships in the world in search of happiness and health and security. But again, the senses are only an advisor, have no decision-making power. They have a limited perspective also, similar to the unconscious. Often wrong, but never in doubt, are the senses. And so sometimes they're correct, and we have a body, we have senses, life is to be enjoyed. So it's not about denial, it's about balance and coordinating all four functions of the mind so that the conscience can tell us what to do and what not to do in a way that will always lead us for our highest good. So now we have two out of the four functions, and the third is the ego, also an advisor, not a decision maker. It is the ego that divides every relationship up into likes and dislikes. Oh, I like this, the ego says. Let's reprise it. But this other situation, this other relationship, I don't like. Let's avoid it. The first one is good, but this one is bad. That's pleasant. This is unpleasant. So the ego, like the unconscious, like the senses, is only an advisor, no decision-making power. And it only has a limited perspective, again, not a 360-degree panoramic view. And that can be a challenge. But the unconscious, the senses, and the ego are loud and they're pushy because each of them wants their individual limited perspective to be served. And that brings us, of course, to the conscience. Now, wonderfully so, the conscience is the decision maker. Every decision we've ever made, every decision we make today, every decision that we will make in our entire lives is always made by the conscience. And when the ego, the senses, and the unconscious mind are not coordinated, which is the human condition for most human beings today, when the ego, senses, and unconscious mind are not coordinated, your conscience merely rubber stamps the loudest voice that it can hear, which often is incorrect and causes pain. But when coordinated, all four functions of the mind, when the unconscious and the senses and the ego are coordinated to the conscience, your conscience can reflect superconscious wisdom from the center of consciousness to advise you 24/7. What's to be done and what's not to be done, so that you can be led for your highest and greatest good without pain. And I thought that that was important enough to make that presentation to summarize, because the conscience is going to make a choice. It's the only decision maker. Will it just be a rubber stamp of the loudest voice, often wrong, bringing pain? Or can we experiment with coordinating the 4 functions of the mind so that our conscience can be our life's guide? Thank you.
Thank you, Leonard. This teaching has been so meaningful for me, and I am so grateful for it. It's one of those things that is so elegantly simple, and yet when it comes time to rehearse how we do this, it takes a lifetime. And I appreciate the clarity that you just shared with us. So thank you. Okay, now I would like to introduce you to our very first speaker, Dr. Kristen Kelber, and she will share her experience with us about how the conscience has impacted her in the realm of health. Kristen.
Thank you, Jennifer. When I was asked to speak about how to use your conscience to achieve optimal health, I immediately thought of how my conscience helps me to make optimal food choices. For me, one of the most profound ways to improve one's health is through food choices. So many decisions must be made around food, which influence our ability to either have optimal health or to develop certain chronic illnesses. Everyone must choose which foods to eat, when to eat, how much to eat, and in what way will we eat. These decisions come to us every day. As I began to study yoga science, it taught me to pay attention and to be more present with my choices and to listen to my conscience when making decisions. Food choices are a solid starting point as a yoga scientist to learn to coordinate the 4 functions of our mind and to truly listen to our inner wisdom or conscience. When I make a food choice, such as whether to eat an apple or a donut for a snack, all the functions of the mind, all 4 of the functions are involved. My senses smell and see the apple. My unconscious mind has memories and attachments to both of these foods. And my ego has certain automatic opinions about the apple or the donut. But only the conscience knows what is the best decision to make about whether to eat the donut or the apple. After making the choice of which snack to eat, it is also my conscience that helps me see whether the result of eating either food is in alignment with my inner wisdom. I recognize that in the past, and even to this day, many of my choices around food are driven by the unconscious mind. This function of the mind stores our habits around food choices. It shares our likes and dislikes, but it is the conscience which makes the final. The practice of yoga science allows us to hear the voice of the conscience so that we might make different decisions to improve our health. From my experience, when I listen to the conscience, I find that I can make the best decisions in the moment. When I employ the bridge of yoga to base my outer actions on my inner wisdom, I have noticed that other aspects of the eating process are also important for achieving optimal health. For example, one-pointed attention while eating is very beneficial for digestion. When I sit quietly for a meal and pay attention to what I'm eating in terms of its smell, tastes, and colors, I notice that I feel less tired after eating and have better digestion. When I decide to sit and pay attention to my food, I find that I chew my food more thoroughly. As I examine the food experiments that I have completed, I have begun to contemplate where the food came from and whether to continue to eat the same things or to make different choices in the future. I have also begun to examine whether I was eating out of boredom or stress, or was I truly hungry? Years ago, I ate a standard American diet full of processed foods and animal proteins. Now, after experimenting with my conscience to employ superconscious wisdom, I have found that I enjoy much better health. When I minimize processed foods and animal proteins and instead focus my diet on vegetables, beans, fruits, whole grains, and seeds, I have felt better physically, have slept better, and tend to feel happier. But these kinds of changes in my food choices were by no means a straight, quick path. Rather, my food choices have evolved over time as I have listened to my conscience making thousands of different, better decisions and cultivated the new habit of coordinating the four functions of my mind. It is definitely still a work in progress, but the decisions become easier the more I listen to the conscience. I encourage people to examine their food choices and ways that they eat, because it is a powerful way to practice using the conscience in everyday simple choices to improve one's health. Start with something small, such as the next snack that you choose to eat. You could also begin with choosing to eat with one pointed attention instead of doing two things at once, like reading and eating at the same time. The experiments that you do to practice using your conscience around food choices can lead to surprising conclusions that can optimize your health too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kristen. And I really appreciate your sharing that it's a work in progress and that it's a journey and that it's not necessarily a straight line. This is how I started too, was with food choices. And I've slipped and then I go back, and it's, because when you do these experiments and you feel the change in your energy, that's what then helps me make the next right choice. But it's a process, like you said. So thank you. Okay, next we have Amy Laskowitz, who will share her experience about the impact of the conscience on parenting.
Thank you, Jennifer. As a mother of 3 young children, I have to think about creative ways to introduce my children to their conscience. So to get them acquainted with it, we use the simple question, is it kind? Is it kind to others? Is it kind to ourselves? And we work with that. 2 years ago, my conscience prompted me to deepen my practice by making an unbreakable commitment to incorporate seated meditation into my daily routine. For a long time before that, my ego had me convinced it would be impossible to add anything else into my day. As parents, we have so much on our plate when we can feel so crunched for time. Our children have so many extracurricular activities, engagements, and schoolwork that our exhaustion is exacerbated by the tension created by an apparent time deficit. But what I didn't realize prior to incorporating a seated practice was that it wasn't a time deficit that had me so exhausted. It was a speeded up mind. My experience was, by listening to the wisdom of the conscience and adding a daily meditation practice, my energy levels increased, my focus increased, and the time that I thought I was lost was actually regained. As I became more calm and less stressed, my mental energies pulled together more and more, limiting my distractibility and increasing my reserves of patience and empathy. I was supported by the conscience with insights and deeper understandings. By giving the mind the mental training of slowing down and stillness, I was moving more gracefully through emotionally triggering moments with my young children. Slowly, I was noticing that circumstances that used to trip me up no longer held that same power. I was free to parent according to the ideals laid out by my conscience. Spontaneous creative insights were arising with greater frequency that helped me handle situations with my children in ways I hadn't considered before. In giving the mind the quiet focus of meditation, I was opening the door wider and wider to the creative insights of my conscience and creating a space that halted habitual responses from old, unhelpful habit patterns. The most powerful learning I had in beginning my meditation practice was that I had to be the change that I wanted to see in my children. I couldn't will them to act differently through reprimand or redirection alone. My experience was it just didn't work. How many times have we heard parents say, my kids just don't listen? I don't think it's as simple as they don't listen. I think they're listening to everything. Young children are like sponges. In my experience, if I wanted kindness from my kids, I had to emulate kindness. If I wanted patience, my responses had to be patient. The longer my daily practice continued, I began to realize the profound impact my meditation practice had on the entire household. I was the only one meditating, but as my personality calmed, my children were similarly calmed. As I became more patient with my children, they became more patient with each other. With the help of my conscience, I began to see that my children's behavior was a mirror to my own. And if I disapproved, it meant I had work to do. They also benefited because by slowing down and really taking notice of what was behind their behavior in any given moment, I was better equipped to see what they actually needed and support them in a more loving way. By stepping away from emotionally reactive responses, I was able to act on the guidance of my conscience and continue to stand down the rough edges in my own personality. Bringing this back full circle to the opening question of, is it kind? The last thing I want to say is that if you too are a parent or anyone looking to change a habitual response that may not be in alignment with kindness, be patient and be gentle with yourself. Listen to your conscience and start with the small, easy steps. If I told you that I wanted to run a marathon without running a single mile beforehand, you would logically know that I would either be unsuccessful or cause harm to my physical body. However, when it comes to how we exist in the mental field, specifically in our relationships, we do not offer ourselves the same compassion. Generally, the expectation is that we must enact huge sweeping changes with immediacy through sheer force of will. While we may be able to enact change in our behavior through sheer will force when we are rested and calm, that approach is usually not lasting and often fails us when we are taxed by strong emotions or triggering circumstances. Taking the time to give your mind the mental training it needs of slowing down in this speeded up culture will support you in hearing the voice of your conscience and making the changes you wish to make. Not only is it the greatest gift you can give yourself, but it is a gift you extend to your children as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. And I am reminded, as you were mentioning about how your behavior you saw mirrored in your children. As a daughter, I see it working the same way too. I have an 84-year-old father, and that is not always it can be a challenging relationship, and it has been really impacted by my practice and by my own attempts to coordinate, and as you say, really use the conscience to be kind. It just makes such a difference to everybody. So it goes both ways, parent to child and child to parent. So thank you. Okay, and next we have DJ Hellerman. DJ will share with us what has happened when he has used his conscience in the realm of sleep. DJ.
Thank you. And thanks for asking me to be a part of this. I'd also like to thank everybody who did a lot of hard work preparing for this event, both on the camera and behind the scenes. Okay, so one of the things that I love the most about this teaching in Lineage is that it always presents questions and never answers. So I've become very excited and amused at the difficulty of living the questions that this teaching brings to me. Every situation is a decision about how to use my conscience to not only address the situation directly in front of me, but how I can approach every situation as a way to deepen my own life. So I guess with that preamble, I was asked to discuss sleep. And I have to admit that my first reaction was, oh no, I sleep really well. So what can I possibly share with anybody on this topic? um, so here's how the narrative, my experiment went. Um, Sitting with the prompt of sleep for a week or so led me to an interesting and unexpected place. Since I told myself that I was already a perfectly fine sleeper, I began to contemplate rest. I started paying close attention to ways that I steal rest from myself while I was awake. Um, when am I cramming and when am I trying to do too much? So I asked myself a couple of questions. Where am I not allowing myself to rest throughout the day? What is non sleeping rest? How am I unnecessarily complicating my life and draining my energy? And when I rush, who is actually creating that situation? So I realized, not surprisingly, that I try to pack too much into nearly every aspect of my life. One small example is that I recognized that I had slowly developed a bad habit of trying to get work done during my 25-minute walk to work each day. So, in the name of efficiency, I would make work calls, respond to emails. So, I just decided to let my walking commute be relaxing and a fun exercise to notice everything that was around me. I've recently moved to a new city. It's an exciting time, and I just want to be sure to be very present on my walk. Besides, any email that I'd spend 10 to 15 minutes typing with my thumbs on the walk to work would only take about 2 minutes on my computer, and I could be way more focused and thoughtful in my response. So, as I continued to think about rest, I remembered a realization that I had a while back when studying the Katha Upanishad. The Katha Upanishad is a story, it's an important conversation between a young man named Nachiketa and the Lord of Death named Yama. For me, it was a story that allowed me to understand how to live better by contemplating and developing a more expansive understanding of death and being open to change. I learned during studying that text that one way of living well is to make sure I get a good night's sleep, and by making sure that each day is resolved before I go to bed. When I said to myself, making sure I get a good night's sleep, I realized that I've been just tossing myself into bed each day out of exhaustion. I haven't intentionally been making sure of anything. So I've started to examine the routine and the ritual, something I'm thinking of like a daily ceremony of putting myself to sleep. Wise teachers of mine have said, we don't go to sleep, rather, we prepare ourselves for sleep to come to us. We invite sleep. It's something that is received. And on the other side, waking up, thinking about how I'm exiting sleep and transitioning into the day. So right now, I've started to incorporate more Ayurvedic practices. I'm experimenting with scraping my tongue, a practice that makes a lot of sense to me. I'm trying to limit my screen time before bed. And I'm doing this because the type of light the phone emits, and because my thoughts and emotions are able to be less pushed around when I don't do whatever it is that I'm deciding to do on my phone. And I've also shifted the time of my evening meditation so that I can do it a few hours before bed, because for me that meditation is somewhat of, I guess, an energizing practice. So I'll conclude um, with this. One of the most important lessons that I've learned by working with my conscience is to be self-possessed and not reactionary, to move with confidence, composure, purpose, and more often with joy. I'm not perfect, but my conscience is a consistent source of inspiration, leading me to realize that I can always make a small and manageable change to improve any aspect of my life, even when, or I guess, especially in this situation, especially when I tell myself that I sleep well. Thank you.
Thank you, DJ. I'm just listening to you. I'm just reminded it all matters. It matters what we eat before we go to bed. It matters we watch. It matters. It all matters. And so making these, as you say, these small changes one at a time adds up. And it's so beautiful to have a good night's sleep and wake up in the morning actually feeling rested. So thank you. Okay, next we have Valerie Chiquitas, who will share with us how her conscience has helped her to access patience and kindness in the realm of some personal relationships. Valerie.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. A few weeks ago, I had dinner with a family member from out of town. I love him, but I sometimes get impatient and annoyed. How to become more patient and kinder? Basically, figure out the why I'm impatient and do something about it. The key to doing that is understanding how the mind works with the four functions. The unconscious is the storehouse of all experiences and the source of many automatic reactions. The ego is the function of the mind that, among other things, determines our likes and dislikes. This combination generates many habitual responses I'm not even aware of. This family member is likely to show up unexpectedly on a very short notice. Often he is on his way to or returning from somewhere else. During contemplation, I realized that this trait was part of why I felt impatient and annoyed. The ego has a strong desire for routines and predictability, especially in social situations. He challenges those desires. These desires also indicate a degree of inflexibility on my part. However, if the ego could experience such visits with less rigidity, the feelings might be different. Flexibility is both physical and mental. Therefore, more mental flexibility allows for more consideration of others and a willingness to change and to do something different. During contemplation, other deep feelings came into my awareness. They had to do with an internal conflict concerning the lack of consistency between what I think and what I do. This family member is gentle, intelligent, helpful, and a really nice person. He is also a very unconventional person. He doesn't conform to expected norms of lifestyle, dress, work, etc. I accept him and appreciate his pursuit of his purpose in his own way. However, that isn't entirely the case. This personality has conflicting feelings about his lack of conformity. He doesn't follow many norms of society, and I've been unconsciously judging him on that. Being unconventional is suspect in our culture. I've had a fear I call guilt by association. That's a fear of others judging me based on him. Of course, I'm not happy to admit that fear. And truthfully, that fear isn't justifiable. I don't agree with many of the same societal norms that he seems to violate. This is an example of an inner conflict. My inner wisdom isn't guiding my outer behavior. But with awareness and using my conscience and my higher knowledge, I can transform that fear, stop the judging, and begin to free myself of cultural influences that I find harmful, such as the emphasis on money and material things that are the measurements of success, happiness, and power. The more I understand and coordinate my mind, the less these influences impact my thoughts, words, and actions. It's impossible to avoid cultural influences that surround us or avoid absorbing them without thought. But not recognizing the conflict or denying it allows it to continue. But when we recognize the inner conflict, we can change it. It is the conscience with access to the higher knowledge that can judge and discriminate between these cultural influences and guide us in choosing the things to be done and the things not to be done. However, when the unconscious and ego are the loudest voices, as Leonard said, it is likely the conscience will sign off on their choices. Regardless of the nature of the relationship, I can always look at it from the perspective of, how do I contribute to this situation? The saying is, you can't change anyone else, you can only change yourself. The point is, if I don't change, the internal conflict continues, and so does the pain. Thankfully, knowing the four functions of the mind, I understand what I can do to be more patient and kind. Follow my conscience. Fortunately, the conscience is always available to guide me. As has already been said, it is a process, which means it takes time and effort. However, having the tools to discern and reduce the internal conflicts helps me be more patient and kinder in all circumstances, not just with my family member. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. And thank you for your emphasis on the importance of contemplation, and that it really is in understanding our own minds, and that can help us to transform all of our relationships. So thank you so much. Next up is Jeff Kirby, who will talk to us about how the use of his conscience has led him to be less angry. Jeff.
Thank you, Jennifer. Well, I never saw anger as a problem. It's just something that everyone experiences at various intervals and various degrees of intensity, the same as fear or joy. Until I was told I was actually in charge of these emotions and could control my own response in every situation, I thought I was at its mercy. When I first heard that I am not the thoughts, emotions, or desires that arise in the mind, that they are in fact only suggestions from the unconscious mind, senses, and ego, and not imperial commands, I was skeptical. So I began to experiment. Now again, I never considered myself to be an angry person. At the same time, I knew I needed to change. And that is why and when a teacher appeared in my life and asked the question, so how's that working for you? Hence the experiments began. By simply remembering to focus on breathing for a second and bringing a mantra into my awareness, I began to see results. The first example of this I can recall was in traffic. And instead of riding up on someone who was not keeping up with traffic and therefore intentionally delaying me from my arrival to my destination and angrily beeping my horn, I thought of the person behind the wheel of the other vehicle and immediately found patience in the place of anger. This felt wonderful and encouraged me to continue with the experiments. The next place this newfound patience revealed itself was on the job site. I'm a carpenter, and when things weren't going the way I anticipated, I would yell, or a tool might even take flight. But all this has changed. First of all, These situations come up less because my attention is more focused. But if it does come up, I'm simply more patient and resolution comes much more easily. Experimenting with this practice has literally made me a better carpenter. Results have also showed up at home. As a husband and father who didn't have the knowledge or the tools in place to properly deal with stress, I would often raise my voice, therefore intimidating those around me. The reduction or even elimination of this response to stress has made home life much more enjoyable for me and the entire family. I've become a kinder person to myself and to others. It's not that the emotion of anger doesn't arise, but now I recognize it immediately and decide not to accept it or the regrets that follow. And this is working for me. Now, these experiments require some courage to change and a will to change and even a little faith, but only at the onset. Faith comes naturally with the results, and fear is dissipated through knowledge. The knowledge that comes from experience and listening to the conscience. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. It's just amazing to me how these benefits just sort of keep popping up, you know, in all the different areas of our life. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, next up we have Tony Santilli, who will share with us the impact of his conscience. Dr. Tony Santilli, I should say, who will share with us how his conscience has impacted him at work.
Thanks, Jennifer. I think the best example I can say how I've used my conscience at work is in my relationship with a patient that I had many years ago, and ultimately was a relationship with myself. I met the patient in the hospital. He was awaiting heart surgery, and I'm a lung doctor by training, and they asked me to see him to see if he could tolerate a lung surgery. He completed his heart surgery, and while I wasn't positive he could tolerate the lung surgery, I didn't listen to my conscience. I didn't really want to upset the surgeon. I thought maybe it would be okay. And subsequently, he underwent the surgery many months later. He had a bad outcome with the surgery. It wasn't necessarily because of the reason I thought he'd have a bad outcome, but again, I did not listen to my conscience, and a bad outcome resulted. After he had the bad outcome, he went from a very functional person to being dependent on oxygen, in fact, a fair amount of oxygen. And he was quite debilitated. Over the many months after his surgery, I would see him very regularly in the office because we never knew why he was so sick after the surgery. And slowly, I began to piece the puzzle together of why he could not function as well as he did prior to the surgery. Finally, on a Friday afternoon, I had ordered a test that showed the complication. Now, this was many months after he had the surgery. When I first got the results, my initial reaction was fear. And it wasn't really fear for him, it was fear for me, that I had missed this for months. And it was fairly obvious. So I called him up and told him to go to the hospital. And now I have my first decision with my conscience. What is my response here? From a fear perspective, I kind of wanted to just go away. And I could have let it go away. It was a Friday. He would have gone into the hospital. One of my partners would have seen him. But that didn't feel right. And at this point, I was going to start to listen to my conscience and do what it thought was correct. Similarly, I also had something very special planned with my son that morning. And so now I had to coordinate two things. What was going to be the more appropriate thing to do, to go to the hospital or to do the activity with my son? So what I did was I did both. I brought my son with me to the hospital. I met with the patient and I told him honestly what happened. Uh, uh, and then I went and did the activity with my son. The second thing that I had to ask myself, and again, it ultimately becomes a relationship with yourself, was how do I approach this with the patient? Because I felt bad. Now, I was always trained that you never apologize to a patient because it invites a lawsuit. But that didn't feel right. It felt like I should apologize. So I apologized. And with little regard to what the outcome was for my own personal need, because that's what my conscience stamped as the appropriate thing to do. He subsequently needed another surgery to correct the complication from the first surgery. And he needed to go down to New York City, about 2 hours away from where we are here, to get that surgery. He was scared. And I met with him. This was a couple of days later while he was still in the hospital. And I decided to give him my cell phone. Now, prior to this, I had never given any patient my cell phone for fear that people would just be calling me all the time. Subsequently, I have given patients my cell phone, but he was the first. And because again, it's what my conscience told me to do, or I should say what my conscience said was the correct thing to do. He ultimately didn't get the surgery, and that was another learning point for me, because I wanted him to get it. I wanted to feel better about what had happened, and if he got the surgery to correct it, I think that would have made me feel better. But obviously, it's his decision. So I worked with myself to be empathetic to his position and understanding of his position, which again was completely opposite to prior relationships with patients. Subsequently, over the next many years, he and I had a very nice, in my opinion, relationship between a doctor and a patient. He would call me when he was in trouble. I would, occasionally it would be after hours and occasionally wouldn't, but it's not like he called me too often. And it was a very rewarding relationship, I think, on both sides. This past year, he subsequently died from the same illness that he had from the complication of his surgery. And in looking back, when I had to piece this presentation together, I felt like he was the best example of how I changed from a doctor that played a role, just telling people what to do, to someone that used intuitive healing directed by the conscious to not only heal him and heal patients, and to heal myself. And my subsequent relationship with patients has been much more rewarding. Now, outcomes may come and go with patients, and I don't have control over that. But the relationship I have practicing medicine, doing my work, is a much more rewarding, pleasant experience. So whether it's at work or anywhere else, employing the conscience changes things, in my experience, for the better. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Tony, for that very powerful story. And it just makes me think that, we are all playing these roles in our professional lives and sometimes in our personal lives. And there's a level of courage, would you say, that you found to do it differently, to use your conscience in a way that went that was counter to your training. It's really powerful. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, next we have Barbara Rule, who will share with us how her conscience has helped her to be happier, no matter what. Barbara.
Thank you, Jennifer. I want to thank everybody in our community who's shared tonight. It's just a wonderful reminder about where I've been and, how we've all struggled to finally use our conscience. And I really appreciate everyone. Thank you. Not everyone defines happiness in the same way, but something we all have in common is that our lives are constantly changing. We never know what the future will bring. Once I learned how to work with my ego, senses, unconscious, and my conscience, I was able to build trust in myself, my higher self, that I could confidently handle whatever new opportunity might come my way. I'm grateful for any and all opportunities that help me to learn and grow, even if they're uncomfortable, because I know they're going to prepare me for whatever comes next. In my personal experiments working with my conscience, I've learned that being happier requires slowing my mind down. This allows me to check in with my conscience to ensure that I'm serving my highest and greatest good. I've also discovered that it's important to stay humble, to examine the choices I've made each day and ask myself if they served my highest and greatest good. If my choices didn't serve me or others well, I examine the reasons why I acted the way I did. This process of self-examination brings an awareness which helps me to understand myself and make better choices. Slowing down, checking in with the conscience, staying humble, and contemplating the choices I make daily has provided me with a steady path to a happier life. In our unconscious, we store our memories and emotions, and even stories we may have told ourselves to compensate for painful or traumatic experiences. When a situation arises in the present that triggers a past memory or emotion stored in our unconscious, we may react with an emotional response from our past. We may find that we become easily overwhelmed, panic when certain emotions arise, get angry easily, cry uncontrollably, or experience chronic physical pain and illness. We're unable to stop these recurring emotional responses and stories we've told ourselves until we become aware of how and why we respond the way we do, and until we make a conscious choice to change how we respond and behave. Until I began to meditate, I was unaware that a painful experience with my father at age 8 left me thinking that I was not good enough. My thoughts about myself led to behaviors like procrastination, perfectionism, and the belief that I was an imposter in my professional life and afraid of being judged. Situational triggers and debilitating beliefs caused me to sabotage myself over and over again throughout my life. After taking AMI's foundation course, I began employing a daily contemplation practice. I wrote about incidents that triggered me, explored the emotions that arose, and evaluated how I could react differently when similar situations arose. My contemplation helped me to become aware of what was real and what was unreal, and I began practicing self-compassion. When old thoughts about not being good enough arose, I parented the little child within myself who had been asked to take on a task way beyond her capability, failed miserably, felt shame and rejection, and blamed herself. Although my little child did not have the capacity to fend herself against the injustice she'd experienced, my adult self knew it wasn't true that the little girl wasn't good enough. As an adult, I desperately wanted freedom from the shame and sorrow that was constantly being triggered. I continued to work the practice, and during my meditation, I arrived at the realization that forgiving my father was key to letting go of the memory of not feeling good enough. During contemplation, I recalled a conversation with my father about a very painful experience he'd had with his mother. My love and compassion for my father and the pain he had suffered from hurtful words his mother had said to him helped me to see that we'd experienced similar painful experiences. I also realized that I had said hurtful words to family members I loved, and I wanted to stop this behavior. Taking responsibility for my own actions and stopping this recurring cycle of pain allowed me to forgive my father and to let go of the thoughts that I was not good enough. I trust that the supreme reality will not bring any challenges to me that I cannot handle. By working with my mind and my conscience, I no longer feel hijacked by my emotions, my ego, and untruths I've been telling myself. I now have the freedom to be a happier person, no matter what. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barbara, for sharing that deeply personal story. And I'm so happy for you that these teachings have made such a difference. And I heard you. It's a phrase that has been important for me too. That the reliance on our conscience helps us to stay humble and also be more capable in every situation. So thank you for that very powerful reminder. Okay, and now our last presenter of the evening is Janice Cortez, who will share with us how her reliance on the conscience has impacted her life's work as an artist. Janice.
Thank you, Jennifer. How does the conscience serve the artist? Before I begin, I want to read a quote from Joseph Campbell. It's very simple. Eternity is in love with form. And what does that mean? Eternity doesn't mean a really long time. It means the infinite, beyond time. Eternity is the supreme intelligence, the timeless, birthless, deathless creator and sustainer of the universe is, as Campbell so poetically states, clearly in love with form. Just look around the universe and you'll be dazzled. This is the love of form. Eternity is in love with form, and every one of us is instrumental in that romance, whether we consciously consider ourselves to be artists or not. We all create forms. We make homes and gardens, buildings of all kinds. We engineer roads and rivers and machines. And we establish the very real but non-physical forms of family, friendships, and nations, philosophies, religions, and countless other forms defined and supported by our endless creative urges. But those of us who work as artists in a more narrow sense, as visual artists or singers or writers of any kind, dancers or composers as examples, are more consciously making forms. And we are by trade receivers. This is an important point. Our ideas are not our own. So how do these forms come to us? By what means? They come to us, whether in response to our call or by pure grace, through the conduit we refer to as the conscience. The possibilities are limited only by our capacity to receive. So this sounds all very poetic, and it is. It sounds theoretical, and it is. So let's get practical. I'll share a few things that I have found in my own experience of working with the conscience. There are a few essentials, and the very first one is giving up ownership. Make sure the ego gets out of the way. You're not asking the infinite power of the universe for a personal favor. You're offering your heart, mind, and body for the creation of a gift to the world. You are the instrument, not the doer and not the owner of the creation. The second point is that you have to come to a stop. Your mind has to come to a still point. Attention freed for a while from the random busyness of the mind, and you need to wait there. If thoughts intrude, let them come and go, but be patient. And return to the open space in which the voice of your conscience can be received. And it will be. When the mind is calm, clearly state your need and wait with attention. Be still, be patient, be confident, be open. And next, answers will come. When a promising one comes, you must act. And not to be over dramatic here, but you must act immediately, because these things are given to you, and you have to receive them and make use of them in a way that serves their purpose. Do a thumbnail sketch, write down the primary points, record what's come to you immediately. This is important. Use whatever code and abbreviations you need in order to remember. Give form to the subtle intuition now, before the ordinary, small demands of life can wash it away. And finally, the fifth step is start putting the gift into form. Once the answer has come to you, your diligent, generous service is required. This is just as important in any aspect of your life as it is in the creative act of art. Whether you're an artist, whether you're an artist in the literal or the figurative sense, remember that you are playing a role in the great romance. Eternity is in love with form, and you, the artist, are here to be the devoted go-between between eternity and the forms that are waiting to become. So remember your possibilities. Remember that you are open to the conscience, and the conscience is open to eternity. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Janice. I'm very grateful that this webinar is being recorded, because I already know that I'm going to want to listen to that again. It's so helpful. And as a person who makes her living as a writer, so many of the things that you said ring so true, especially that when you have that idea to get it down, to write it down, to post haste, not to delay. So, but there's so much in what you just said. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us. Okay, we have come to the end, and I would like to thank each member of our panel for sharing your experience and you're with us tonight. I thank each of you for listening and for joining us. And I would like to say that if you have any questions or want any more information about anything about the conscience, about the bookstore at AMI, about any of the courses that are offered, you can reach out to us by email. It's ami@americanmeditation.org. And there's lots of information on the website, including descriptions of all of the courses and photos of the bookstore and the books that are included there at the bookstore. So please make use of that resource. So with that, I say good evening, and I offer the last word lovingly to my teacher, Leonard Perlmutter.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank each of you. It was a delight to be in your presence, to hear your experiments that you have done over the years with the conscience and coordinating the functions of the mind. And it just brings into sharp focus what I've said for years and years now, is that all life is relationship. We are always interacting with some form of a relationship. But relationships are not always what we think they are. We have several different forms of relationships. We have subtle and more concrete or gross kinds of relationships. What are subtle relationships with which we engage? Well, our thoughts, just the thinking process, our desires, what we want. These are relationships. And emotions. These too are relationships. The more concrete or gross form of relationship that we all have are with objects like our own body and the bodies of other human beings, with our work, with our recreation, with the food that we consume, with the sex